protections assigned to them. Foreign direct investment were adapted to industrial policies that favor export sectors while immersed in a process of progressive economic openness. Domestic tariffs progressively fall down in direct relation with the capacity of the Chinese economies to face foreign competition. 55% in 1982, 24% in 1996, and 12% in 2003. In 2006, due to China's entry into WTO in 2001 and the need to comply with its rules, its tariffs went down to 6%. The gradualness of this process should not make us lose sight of its velocity. The extraordinary magnitude of the changes occurred in such a little time is the best proof of it, whose result has been the fastest growth in any major economy in the documented history of humanity, an average 9% during 30 years. A growth that has made possible for China to take out of poverty 400 million human beings and to quadruple the average income of every citizen. Nowadays, China is the second economy in the world, and it expands to become the third decade of the present century. Not surprisingly, a so-called Beijing consensus began to attract the imagination of developing economies. The consequences of China's emergence have not been linear for developing economies. Its economic takeoff has led it both to negative and positive effects for them. The more obvious of the first has been the impact of its low-cost manpower that has left many emerging economies with no capacity to compete. That has resulted not only in their loss of export markets, but only of direct foreign investments that have in turn been redirected to China. However, there are several areas in which China's emergence is clearly positive for the developing world. Let's talk about them. After the decline of China and India from the end of the 18th century onwards, the world became Eurocentric. From free trade to Marxism, any paradigm with universal aspiration had to come by definition from the West, the only valid source of legitimation. The Washington Consensus was to become the last of these totalizing paradigms. China's revival, based on the strength of its culture, came over to put an end to this universalism in singular and to give way to a universalism in plural, where there is no room for unique thoughts. Notwithstanding the strength of its culture and history, or perhaps as a result of it, China has an inward-looking vision at odds with the search of global hegemony. According to Kishore Mahbubani, and I quote, "The Chinese mind has always focused on developing Chinese civilization, not developing global civilization. China today is willing to be a responsible stakeholder in the global order, but it shows little interest in leading the creation of a new global order." End of the quote. In other words, China's dealing with the rest of the developing world comes with no strings attached. For a long time, economic preeminence and development were synonymous. However, despite being the second economic power of the planet, and according to estimates, the first in 2035, China remains a developing country and still will be at the time it reaches the pinnacle. This surprising duality makes of China an invaluable standard bearer of the developing world, as it has been proved in numerous multilateral negotiations. The Chinese economic expansion and the huge investments made in infrastructure and urbanization developments have determined a boom period in relation to the price of commodities worldwide. A few examples. China accounts for more than 30% of global growth in oil demand, while it represents 40% of the world's consumption of aluminium, copper, nickel, and iron ore, to quote just a few items. Thanks to that, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and many countries in Asia have been economically pulled up, enjoying of a sustained economic growth that will probably continue for several decades ahead. The downturn of this boom for many developing economies has been, of course, the increase of the international prices of food and energy. China has become an important investor in developing economies. This reached a new momentum on March 9, 2007, when its government announced the creation of the China Investment Corporation, with the aim to invest abroad an important part of its international reserves, which currently amount to $2.4 trillion. An important part of these resources are being directed to countries owning raw materials of a strategic value to China. China's design and manufacture of frugal products, initially directed to domestic consumption, has given access to them to disenfranchised populations all around the world. As we can see, thus, the balance of the Chinese economic growth leans in the positive side for developing countries. And albeit the Chinese expansion has deprived many emerging economies of competitiveness, others have been able to imbricate their economies with China. The latter through supply chains of production, that is, goods moving on different steps through different countries within the same production processes, and as assembly lines are fragmented and scattered around the world. Supply chains of production have become feasible as information technology allows the logistical management of the possible that they represent, and global transportation has gotten cheaper. While IT solves the logistical problems involving following up scattered manufactured parts in different parts of the world, in different places of the world, trucks, trains, ships, and planes acting as a system of the spanning arteries joined them together for final assembly. China will normally be that final destination. There are nonetheless emerging economies whose manufacturing processes are not interconnected with China and that are clearly being affected by it. If climbing through the technological ladder is not an option for them, this economy should try to lean towards the commodities and service sectors so as to avoid direct competition with China. The international tradable services sector would offer them, though, an important possibility to integrate their economies with global value chains, driven by China. Through these chains, manufacturing and services join together as the two sides of the same coin. Thanks to modern telecom and computer technologies, white-collar and blue-collar jobs can interact within the same production process. For countries whose economies have been overwhelmed by China's cheaper products, that would allow interconnecting their economies to China through global production chains. Hence, its designers, accountants, software engineers, financial consultants, or managers could be part of global manufacturing processes whose final assembly point are taking place in China. As for the hike in international food or energy prices mentioned as another downturn for emerging economies, for developing economies, there are many additional responsible factors in addition to China's increased consumption, not least among them the improvement in feeding and standard of living in most of developing countries. No, not worried. However, some analysts consider that the days of high economic growth are numbered for China. The conjunction of more top strikes and the pay rise in iconic companies has rung the alarms of Western media regarding China. Much is said about the country reaching what economists call the Lewis turning point. That is to say, that particular point, that particular period for an emerging economy in which manpower starts to be scarce, bringing about inflation and decreasing economic growth. Some analysts argue that as China will inevitably be forced to rush up in the technological ladder, jobs and companies will migrate to Vietnam and other centers of cheaper manpower. It is correct to point out that the cost of manpower is rising and that the country is rushing up in the technological ladder. But this is happening at the cost of provinces where the industrial production has been concentrated until now. Inland China, there is an immense human mass that can absorb the non-specialized jobs to be abandoned at cost of provinces. But it will be absurd to talk about the Lewis turning point at this time. According to The Economist, June 12, 2010, China has at its disposal a working age population of 977 million people that in 2015 will rise to 993 million. Although the one-child policy will subsequently reduce the number of new entrants in the work market, and the fact that there will be 30% less in 10 years' time, the sheer magnitude of the numbers involved makes it reasonable to talk about manpower scarcity. Moreover, according to the International Herald Tribune, dated June 2, 2011, 3 elements would prevent the movement of foreign factories currently located in China to other Asian economies. First, because those economies, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, etc., are also rising the cost of the manpower. Second, because corporations prefer to have their plants where their sales are growing faster. Third, because of the sales currency. Manufacturing in China allows companies to endure costs in renminbi, the same currency of the bigger sales. As for technological specialization, the immense Chinese financial resources devoted to research and development, its capacity to access to technology by acquiring it abroad or to transfer by transnational corporations, the capacity of its universities to produce hundreds of thousands of engineers per year, or the large pool of Chinese scientists trained in the US are tools of great importance to reconvert its coastal provinces, which in fact is a process in motion. According to a 2008 study on technological competitiveness by the Georgia Institute of Technology, it will not be long before China surpasses the US in critical capability to develop science and technology and to transform this development in products and services available in the market. Already in 2005, a report from the National Academy of Science of the United States alerted that this country might lose in not such a distant future its condition of world technological leader. The report pointed out, among other things, that in the previous year, China had graduated 600,000 engineers, while the US had only produced 70,000, and that for every qualified US engineer, China would have 11. But the fact that China is quickly advancing towards technological leadership does not have to affect its high economic growth rate, especially if we add to the above mentioned the huge process of urbanization and infrastructural development that is currently taking place in China, and that according to its 11 five-year plan aims to transfer 300 million people from the countryside to urban areas. There is another nation that is normally associated with China, India. The relevance of these two countries has led to the coining of a term frequently used nowadays, Chi-India. The same makes reference to the combined force of two countries that until 1820 represented 50% of the world GDP and which are in their way to reclaim their former preeminence. According to Anil Gupta and Hyen Wang, and I quote, "Starkly put, China and India are changing the rules of the global game. They are two of the world's 10 largest and the two fastest growing economies. Thus, they account for the two biggest growth opportunities for almost any product or service. They are two of the world's poorest economies in terms of per capita income. Thus, they offer some of the lowest wage rates for blue and white collar work wage rates that can have a transformational effect on competitive advantage. They are the world's two largest producers of science and engineering graduates. Thus, they represent an opportunity to radically expand a company's intellectual capabilities without a proportionate increase in cost structure. And finally, they are the breeding ground for a new cohort of ambitious, aggressive, and fast-moving global champions." End of the quote. The combination of rapid growth and big population that characterizes both China and India offers them a spectacular advantage. Despite of its fast growth in previous decades, Japan could have never expected to surpass the US for the simple reason that its population is hardly 40% of that of America. On the contrary, China would only require that its per capita incomes becomes a quarter of that of the US in order to surpass in size the American GDP. Hereafter, its population dimension would allow China to guarantee itself several additional decades of sustained economic growth at high rate. Something similar could be said about India. Not surprising, the above-mentioned authors estimated that on the decade of 240, both countries will represent 40% of the total world market. Let's just mention that according to a Euromonitor international study, China's middle class will reach 700 million people in 2020. That is 48% of the total population of the country. Whereas McKinsey estimates that by 2025, India's middle class will reach 583 million people. That is 41% of its total population. But of course, the extraordinary emergence of the developing world is not limited to those two economies. Brazil, together with them and Russia, the later not a southern hemisphere country, or a developing economy, by the way, was part of the so-called BRIC. Moreover, Goldman Sachs, that in 2003 had coined the acronym BRIC, muted in 2005 their successors, calling them the Next 11, or N11. Among them, Mexico, Vietnam, Turkey, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Bangladesh. In 2006, PricewaterhouseCoopers published a report called The World in 2005, where it listed its own emerging candidates under the so-called E7: China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey, and Russia. In 2010, the BRICS, already a formal group, decided to incorporate South Africa as one of them, giving birth to the BRICS. A year before, the OCDE has coined the terms BRICS, including not only South Africa but also Indonesia. In 2006, the BRIC Economic Research Institute of Japan created the acronym VISTA to include their own list: Vietnam, Indonesia, South Africa, Turkey, and Argentina, and so on. Nonetheless, India, the BRIC, the BRICS, the BRICS, the VISTA, the N11, or the E7 are just the tip of the iceberg of the emerging economy. And even now, and this is important for emerging economies and developing economies are not synonymous concepts, and this is something that has to be outlined. The fact that the overwhelming majority of the former come from the later makes that for all practical purpose we can equate both notions. The truth of the matter is that when developed economies created the conditions for the globalization process to work, pushing it to its limits, they were short-sightedly promoting at the same time their own economic decline and the strengthening of the South. That decline has materialized in several ways. The first, by outsourcing its blue-collar jobs to developing economies, which has been tantamount to transferring to them its industrial might. According to the World Bank, 20 years ago, developing countries provided just 14% of rich countries' manufacturing inputs. But by 2006, that figure increased to 40%, and by 2030, it should rise to more than 65%. The second, by offshoring its white-collar jobs to developing economies and thus relying on the strength of foreign brains at the expense of making their own increasingly reductive. In 2008, the United States moved 2.3 million service industry jobs overseas, and the United Kingdom 650,000. But the situation is much more serious than this. Princeton's economist, Alan Blinder, has argued that impersonal services, that is, those services that can be provided at distance, will tend to disappear from developed nations in order to be relocated in developing ones, where the costs are much lower and where a huge talent pool is available. That may imply tens of millions of jobs migrating from the West into developing economies. Moreover, according to Blinder, it would seem that high-wage jobs performed by highly educated employees in the United States are, if anything, more offshoreable than other service jobs. The third, by transferring Western technology to China in a massive way. That happens as a means to gain access to its huge potential market or through direct sale. General Electric is a good example of the former, as it is handing over its most sophisticated aeronautical electronic technology in order to benefit from the Chinese aeronautical market, which will be generating $400 billion in sales during the next 20 years. The selling of technology by American or European countries frequently implies the selling of companies itself to China. From Volvo to MG, from the PC, from IBM's personal computer division to numerous medium-sized Silicon Valley corporations, this is a process in motion.